assassination as public policy. It's the first Sunday in Advent on the Christian calendar. Advent means the coming. What is it that is coming? My own hope is for nothing less than a new order in the world, an order based on the principles Jesus preached in the Sermon on the Mount. After all, in the next few weeks we will all send each other cards that say peace on earth, which in the Luke version of the Nativity story is the song the angels sang to the shepherds. So it's altogether appropriate to start with one of the factors most out of sync with this vision, which is the use of drones to carry out attacks against supposed terrorists anywhere in the world. I will try not to drone on too much this morning. You may wonder why we should care. The people being killed by our unmanned aircraft are half a world away and supposedly have been engaged in plots to do harm to Americans. I will tell you why I care. You will have to find out your own reason to care. I was present at a state-sponsored killing. I was in the room at a prison in South Carolina in February of 1998 when people acting for the state injected my client with a lethal dose of poison, and we all watched him die. All his life, John Arnold had carried a red wine birthmark that covered much of his face. As the poison seeped into his system and his life stopped, I saw that face turn from red to gunmetal gray. I'll never forget it. That execution took place after a lot of due process had been given. 20 years worth of court consideration had been spent on the question of whether to put him to death. I opposed and continue to oppose the death penalty in all its forms. But I'm especially offended by a death imposed by a government with no court action whatsoever. A death which literally falls from the skies. After a review in which people in closed rooms in the executive branch go over intelligence reports and decide who should die and when. We all know how accurate intelligence reports are. Our religious traditions and values also push the same way. This is a question as old as Cain in the book of Genesis. Am I my brother's keeper? It's as old as the story of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor, whom the law says I should love as myself? It's in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus preaches that if a person strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. And it's as new as our UU principles and purposes, and particularly three. The first, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, asserts that as a matter of moral right, everyone is entitled to be treated as we would like to be treated. It springs from the Golden Rule, which in its negative version says, do not do to others that which you would not have done to you. President Obama said the other day regarding Israel, no country on earth would tolerate missiles raining down on its citizens from outside its borders. But that's exactly what the targeted killing program has been doing in Yemen and Somalia. Another of our principles in play here is the interconnected web of all existence. Injustice anywhere, everywhere, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, said Martin Luther King Jr. An unjust killing anywhere affects all of us in ways that we may not feel immediately, but resonate throughout the chain of karma. But perhaps the most relevant here is the fifth principle, the right of conscience and the use of democratic processes in our congregations and in society at large. What I asserted in opposing the war in Vietnam in my teens, I still believe in my bones today. In a democracy, we are all responsible for the actions of our government. If our government is behaving immorally, we have a duty to point that out and to try to stop it. Silence is complicity. And as I hope to show, it It is our democratic processes which are most under attack by this practice of targeted killing. If the terrorist attacks of 9/11 were an attack on our way of life, and we have responded by jettisoning our most cherished legal safeguards, the depressing conclusion is the terrorists have won. This weekend I saw the movie Lincoln, and its compelling story moved me to tears at several points. The poignancy was enhanced by the fact that every viewer knew that this man who was trying so heroically and so brilliantly to get on top of the wave of history and harness it for a viable future was going to be assassinated. And when it came, even though I saw it coming, my own dam of sorrow burst. The tragedy, the waste wrought by Booth's bullet was felt most particularly in my native Southland in the 20 years afterwards. American history has seen its share of assassinations of presidents and other public figures, many during my lifetime and your lifetimes. Ronald Reagan was one who survived an assassination attempt. And so it is fitting that it was Reagan who in 1981 signed the Executive Order 333, which provides, quote, "No person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination." Unquote. Now that would seem to make it simple. It's illegal for anyone of the government to engage in assassination. It would seem to be a no-brainer. If we can't stop every loner with a political fixation from getting to a public figure with a firearm, at least we can keep government from engaging in assassination as a public policy, as a matter of policy. But nothing is ever that simple. I've used the word assassination deliberately to this point, but I need to say now that the Obama administration and its defenders deny that the drone strikes which the U.S. has been carrying out for the last 10 years are assassinations. Why? Because assassinations are illegal, and it is claimed that these strikes are legal. Defenders of the strikes prefer the more neutral term, targeted killings. Someone's logic is circular here, and maybe it is mine, but in any event, the question is not what you call them, but whether the law allows it. To determine whether the drone strikes are legal is quite a complex exercise, made more difficult by the fact that until this year, the Obama administration has largely maintained secrecy about them. This year, the veil was lifted a bit as Attorney General Eric Holder and attorneys for the White House, Department of Defense, and CIA all gave public speeches about the program. However, the administration still refuses to declassify the legal memo which it has used to justify the program to itself. This secrecy is outrageous. We have an executive order on the books outlawing assassination by employees of the U.S. government. We have a program whereby certain individuals are systematically killed by remote control by vessels operated by the U.S. government. We, the people, are surely entitled to know the rationale under which it is claimed that these killings are not assassinations. This is the people's business. But even hampered by that shroud of secrecy, we can reason our way to an opinion about these strikes. Our primary concern as religious people is not the legality of the strikes, but their morality, which can be quite a different thing. But since law in this area particularly is based on moral considerations, it may help our moral reasoning to at least touch on the legal considerations. From my study in this area, it appears that there are three distinct legal frameworks for approaching the question of targeted killings: the law of war, the international law of self-defense, and human rights law. Each framework depends on different considerations. Let's start with the law of war. If a state of war exists between two nations, It is assumed that one side has the right to seek to kill the combatants on the other side. The deliberate killing of one soldier by another during wartime is not classified as murder because it is a normal, expected action in wartime. And this includes a killing of the highest levels of command, what might otherwise be termed an assassination. Perhaps the most notable example of this is the Japanese naval admiral Yamamoto in World War II. Though Yamamoto had opposed Japanese militarization, it was he who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor and directed the naval war for Japan. In 1943, Allied intelligence decoded radio messages giving the admiral's flight itinerary on a tour of the Japanese installations in the South Pacific. President Roosevelt gave the order, "Get Yamamoto," and it went down the chain of command. The admiral's flight group was ambushed by a squadron of U.S. fighters, and the admiral's plane was shot down over the island of Bougainville. The admiral was killed not by the crash, but by a bullet wound from the fuselage that brought down the plane. While Admiral Yamamoto may have been a reluctant warrior, he was still a warrior, and he was killed in the act of commanding his troops in a military maneuver. For most of us, that will be enough to excuse the killing morally, and it will certainly excuse it under the law of war. His case is similar to that of General Reinhard Heydrich, an architect of Hitler's final solution, who was assassinated in Prague by Czech freedom fighters in 1942. Killing leaders, military leaders, in the course of war is as old as David and Goliath. But would the same rationale extend to civilian leaders? Would it have been legal for the Allies to plot the assassination of Hitler or of Emperor Hirohito? It would arguably shorten the war effort to execute the head of the nation we are fighting, but I don't believe that the law of war would permit it. But that is a side issue. The problem with the war rationale in today's terms is that the term war is such an ill fit for our relationship to terrorist movements and gangs across the world. Traditionally, wars have been considered to be between nations. Our Constitution gives Congress the exclusive power to declare war. In the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks, Congress voted to authorize the President, quote, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Unquote. In the ensuing 11 years, this congressional resolution has been used to justify the indefinite detention of suspects, extraordinary renditions, and targeted killings. Though the resolution did not in so many words declare war, President Bush lost no time in calling the actions against Al-Qaeda a war on terror. The resolution does not say whether the force used will be military or civilian, but the Bush administration quickly opted for a military response. This was a peculiarly American response to terrorism, and in my opinion, it is where we went off the rails. The British have dealt with the terror threat much closer to home for decades without declaring war on terror or on the IRA, and without engaging in systematic assassination, though the IRA, for its part, certainly did. The former director of British intelligence said recently that what Britain had learned from its experience with Irish terrorism is that terrorism is mainly a political and economic, not a military problem. She said, quote, 9/11 was a cruel crime on a vast scale, unquote. Had it been treated as a law enforcement problem rather than the excuse for two wars, we might be living in a very different world today. But however unwise it may have been, the courts have accepted the Bush administration's position that a state of war exists between the U.S. and Al-Qaeda. This would justify strikes against targets in the hot battlefield zones of Afghanistan and Iraq. But what about people working with Al-Qaeda in Yemen and Somalia, countries with whom we are not at war? The administration asserts that, at this point we're talking about the Obama administration, in effect that the battleground is global and individuals can be targeted wherever they are operating. But this claim is greeted with a lot of skepticism around the world. There are plenty of radical Muslims in London, for instance, and some of them may be drawn into terrorist plots. But it is hard to imagine a U.S. drone plane killing someone on British soil. Moreover, the law of war traditionally applies to situations where both the hunter and the hunted are uniformed servicemen. If the drone is controlled and targeted by the CIA, who are civilians, can a strike still hide under the law of war justification? The second legal framework is that of the international law of self-defense. Just as the ordinary criminal law gives an individual a right to use lethal force in self-defense, international law gives a nation, not at war, such a right if certain conditions are met. These conditions were articulated by Daniel Webster, the U.S. Secretary of State, in 1837, after British troops had attacked a private American ship, the Caroline, while it was moored for the night on the American side of the Niagara River outside of Buffalo. The British asserted that they had acted in self-defense as they believed the ship was supplying goods or arms to Canadian rebels that they were fighting at the time. Webster asserted, quote, that an intrusion into the territory of another state can be justified as an act of self-defense only in those cases in which the necessity of that self-defense is instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation, unquote. That has been called the Caroline Standard, and it is still the standard in international law. Spokesmen for the Obama administration, aware that the law of war justification is questionable for drone strikes in countries with whom we are not at war, such as Yemen and Somalia, have fallen back on the right of self-defense. But the only way they can make the Caroline Doctrine fit is by stretching the concept of imminence. Recall Webster's words, to justify lethal force, the threat to the initiating state must be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. It does not seem that a drone strike can ever meet this criterion. For the sketchy news reports we have indicates that drone strikes are planned for days or weeks in advance. We don't know what specific plans are afoot by those who are killed, but it is unlikely, given the nature of technology, that a drone strike ever acts in the instant before a lethal action is launched at U.S. interest. In fact, what controls the timing of a drone strike seems to be not the imminence of the threat against America, but the imminence of the opportunity to kill the target when he is away from others, because we have learned that drone strikes with heavy collateral damage to civilians do not sit well with local populations. Well, I grew up on the Lone Ranger, and the great thing about the Lone Ranger was he never had to hurt the bad guy, but he always showed up just as the bad guy was about to kill the innocent victims, and he would shoot the gun out of the bad guy's hand. Victim saved, bad guy disarmed, no one injured. Great plot device. Doesn't happen like that in real life very often. The third legal framework for analyzing these strikes is the civil liberties considerations enshrined in international human rights law and American constitutional law. Basically, due process requires that before a person is deprived of life, liberty, or property by governmental action, he or she is entitled to notice and an opportunity for a hearing before an impartial tribunal. A day in court. It's basic. It's deeply rooted in the American experience. It's the rule of law and what many of us mean by freedom. Many say due process is a casualty of the war on terror. But if it is, as I said, the terrorists have won. The test of a democracy is to see how it can respond to very real physical threats without sacrificing its basic principles. Drone strikes do not allow for a day in court. There is no accounting for them. We do not know whether those killed were actually plotting violent acts against U.S. interests and how far along they were on these plots. It is often said that the criminal law is too messy, too sloppy to deal with terrorists. The prosecution is required to prove the guilt of the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt by lawfully obtained evidence. But in fact, there are terrorists who are serving long sentences in U.S. jails for the first plot against the New York World Trade Center. Had we been competent in capturing the al-Qaeda leadership and putting them on trial in 2001, they might be serving long sentences now and be removed as a threat. And trials would have dissipated the romance and martyrdom that allows al-Qaeda to continue recruiting. And we would have saved a lot of money we squandered in unnecessary wars. It is true that the criminal law exists mainly to punish conduct which has already occurred, not to prevent harm from occurring. But terrorist cells are not in principle different from the mafia or drug cartels, which are regularly infiltrated by law enforcement and regularly prosecuted and convicted. Last year, a drone strike in Yemen killed Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen who was working with al-Qaeda. He was supposedly the number 2 or number 3 person at the time. Shortly after the death, the New York Times reported on the secret administration legal memo leaked to it, which discussed the legality of a drone strike on this particular man. Even after discussing all of the frameworks we've mentioned here, the memo said that the law had a preference for capturing him if that were feasible so that he could be brought to justice. And that is what I am left with. Where it is feasible to capture a suspected terrorist, respect for the legal system and the rights of all citizens says capture is much better than summary execution. And that is my problem with the killing of bin Laden himself. It seems that with the forces employed, he could have been captured safely. So we have the 3 legal frameworks considering drone strikes: the law of war, the international right of self-defense, and human rights. My own moral sense says that human rights considerations are so basic to who America purports to be that they should triumph except in the cases of the most imminent threats. To say that we will cut down basic constitutional protections to get at terrorists is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Where does this leave us? I don't know of any organized attempt to get the administration to change its policy. The usual suspects like Amnesty International and the EU Service Committee don't seem to have projects aimed at this. I'm going to make what noise I can. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome. But I'm also encouraged by a speech given this Friday in England by the top lawyer at the U.S. Department of Defense, whose name is Jeff Johnson. Speaking at Oxford, Mr. Johnson said that the U.S. has been so successful at decimating the leadership of al-Qaeda that we were headed for the point where military pursuit of its operatives might end. At that point, he said, the administration would no longer rely on the congressional authorization for the use of force in 2001, and the effort would no longer be deemed an armed conflict. Rather, the fight would be turned over to civilian law enforcement agencies. This would be, in my humble opinion, the end of an error of monumental proportions. Look, America is the richest, most powerful nation on earth. We can stand for the proposition that strength comes from fancy, expensive, high-tech weapon systems, and then we live in a world in which we have to fear that other countries will get fancy, high-tech weapon systems. Or we can stand for the proposition that we are committed to becoming the nation Lincoln envisioned us, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal. If we let that light shine and others follow it, what a better world it would be. It is my hope that with the election behind them, the Obama administration might be persuaded to agree.